And we are very happy to be joined, as we always are very happy to be joined, by Zoe Alexandra, who's a journalist and co-editor at People's Dispatch. Zoe, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Always fun.
Well, great. I'm glad, because it's always very informative for us to have you on.
Zoe.
So we are always excited to have you.
Big Zoe fans here at the Freedom Side.
The big People's Dispatch fans overall.
Yeah.
So Colombia. So obviously, you know, we've had you on several times before in the lead up to the election, just after the election. We just have seen the ascension of President Gustavo Petro, Vice President Francia Márquez. They're in there. They're now in office. I know a number of things have happened from the cabinet to negotiations. So, I mean, just give us a sense of where things stand in Colombia now that we have the at least very early days of the new administration.
Well, it's honestly remarkable. And leading up to the elections, there was a lot of hope, a lot of excitement about what this government could look like. And honestly, it continues to be exciting. It continues to be transformative. For example, the Minister of Culture, Patricia Ariza, she is a longtime peace activist. She survived the genocide of the Unión Patriótica. She's founded an activist theater in Bogota. She, for example, decreed that the viche drink of the traditional Afro-Colombian communities in the Pacific Southwest is now going to be protected, that it can't be seized by the police. I mean, this is a small measure, but it really speaks to the fact that this government is deeply invested in protecting traditional communities, supporting the minorities that have been so long oppressed by the government, by successive conservative governments in the country that ignored them, that acted like they were unimportant, that didn't invest in their education and their culture. And that's really just changing on so many levels. This is a small example of what's happening in the Ministry of Culture, but this is happening in so many sectors. The footage you're seeing now is from the swearing in that happened the day before the official swearing in, where Petro and Francia took their time to go with the social movements, who organized the social movement swearing in ceremony, where they committed to supporting social struggle. They committed to putting an end to the genocide of human rights defenders, of social leaders in the country. This is more than a symbolic gesture. This is a really, truly hard commitment to their struggles. And we've seen this. Of course, the paramilitary violence is not going to disappear after 1 week. This is a problem that has been plaguing Colombia for decades. It had to do with a lot of state support, but it will continue even if the state doesn't support them. It's connected to really important economic sectors in the country, drug trafficking groups. And so this is going to take a lot to dismantle. But the government has repeatedly stated that they're committed to stopping this violence against social movements. They're committed to peace. And that, I think, will probably bring us to the next question, which is the tremendous steps that they've taken to actually reach peace in Colombia with only, 11 days in office.
You know, it's also amazing to see what this means for the region and really the continent. I mean, you have the Colombian foreign minister having recently traveled to Cuba to restart these peace negotiations with the ELN, which is quite significant. You also have Colombia normalizing relations with Venezuela, whereas before Colombia was basically the American base of operations to destabilize Venezuela. So what is the significance of all this? What does it mean for the region? What does it mean for the Latin American left?
It's extremely significant. And it's interesting because, again, there was a lot of speculation. Is this going to be just a kind of light progressive government that isn't going to really work with the region and really try to transform the region? But again, after 11 days, I think we can say with a lot of certainty that, no, this is going to be a very progressive government that is going to fundamentally transform the politics that have been happening for the past couple of decades. The relations between Colombia and Venezuela have been incredibly strained, despite being intrinsically linked as countries, as peoples, with a common history of independence, a common history of struggle for liberation. But, you know, during the following kind of these attacks that were led by Washington in the latest period that began with a lot of intensity in 2015, relations have been really strained. The border area has been a site of a lot of conflict between Venezuelan armed forces and paramilitary groups, Colombian armed forces also getting involved. Of course, once the Guaido factor enters, there's been a lot, even more developments happening with, government of Duque providing shelter for Guaido as he went to, stage this humanitarian aid thing on the border. There's been so many examples of paramilitaries that have trained within Colombia to go and try to assassinate Nicolas Maduro. These are really horrible precedents. But again, in the first week of Gustavo Petro's government, he mandated a new ambassador to be appointed to serve in Venezuela, the resuming of talks. This had already happened before his swearing-in ceremony. Álvaro Leyva had already traveled to the border to have a meeting with members of the Venezuelan government. This is huge because these people are intrinsically linked. There's over 4 million Colombians in Venezuela. There are now tens of thousands of Venezuelans in Colombia, so it's not an option for them not to be engaged. And the fact that the government of Iván Duque was so hostile towards Venezuela only hurt the people. And so this is a tremendous step forward. It will be extremely helpful in loosening kind of the attacks against Venezuela because, as I mentioned, Colombia has been a primary partner in not only supporting politically these attacks, but also logistically and materially. And so this is extremely important. And the image you're seeing now of the sword of Simón Bolívar being part of this ceremony, Iván Duque actually tried to prevent the sword of Simón Bolívar from being used in this ceremony. And Gustavo Petro, as his first order as president, he said, bring the sword of Simón Bolívar. This has to be present. And they did that. So it's just emotional. It's very moving. And it really shows the course they're charting.
No, I think that's an important issue, and obviously you've mentioned the issue of peace, and this is, perhaps in many ways the overarching issue of the campaign in and of itself. Now that peace talks have restarted with the ELN, and there's also, of course, the issue of, continuing the existing peace process that was already established with the FARC. I mean, what are some of the contours of what that negotiation may look like with the ELN in terms of actually reaching a deal? And how does that also speak to some of the things that have yet to be implemented, but that Petro, I know, has promised to implement vis-a-vis the past peace deal?
Definitely. So as you said, the implementing a full and lasting peace in Colombia was a primary item on the agenda of the campaign of Francia and Petro, both victims of this conflict in some senses. Francia has not only been displaced from her territory, fighting against a mining company in her region, but also received threats from paramilitary groups. Petro, of course, was a member of the M19. Many of the people that he was part of the movement with were assassinated. Of course, Pizarro, who his daughter swore put the presidential sash on Petro. He was assassinated. He was a presidential candidate from the M19 movement. So peace has always been first and foremost on the agenda. As you said, again, the second day of their government, Gustavo Petro ordered talks to be restarted with the ELN, the National Liberation Army of Colombia. During Duque's presidency, essentially a week into his presidency in August 2018, he suspended a round of talks that was set to happen. He dismantled the delegation of the government to go to Cuba to continue the talks. And these talks had been in development for years. They already had an agenda. They had started in Quito, Ecuador. But of course, the government of Lenin Moreno had essentially said, you have to leave. Cuba, once again, a big promoter of peace in the region, and especially for Colombia, received these talks. And then following the suspension of the peace talks, Duque emitted a red alert through Interpol on the members of the peace delegation, calling for their arrest, calling for their extradition, and Cuba, being a guarantor of peace and having to, comply with international law and these agreements that were made, they did not extradite the members of the peace delegation. This had implications on Cuba. It was put on the sponsors of terrorism list for this reason, for abiding by international law, for abiding by these agreements made in the peace talks. And so the fact that now peace talks are going to resume, as I said, Álvaro Leyva traveled to Cuba last week. He met with not only members of the Cuban government, but also of the peace delegation of the ELN. They're going to restart the talks. One of the key issues in these talks is having the participation of the society in the talks, raising these key demands that have brought Colombians onto the streets for the past several years. And the agenda is already there. They've been saying that they're willing to engage in these talks. And so it's really a matter of time. It seems like the government is building its delegation, and these should be taking place shortly. And it's interesting to note that Álvaro Leyva, in his visit to Cuba, said that Cuba should no longer be on this list of sponsors of terrorism. They've lifted the Interpol alert. They've started talks again, so there's really no justification. Similarly, he said that Colombia does not recognize Guaido. So these two main platforms of the U.S. government that they've been trying to kind of impose across Latin America have, within a week, been completely debunked. And, you know, Washington is seeing that it's going to have a more tough situation with this government of Gustavo Petro. They're not going to lay by their side and say, we're going to, you know, throw everyone else to the side and do what Washington wants.
Yeah, it really is incredible, right? That peace talks, as far as the U.S. is concerned, are considered an act of terrorism. Yeah. That's essentially what you just described. But it is a good point, though, in the sense about the U.S. role here, because, you know, like you've been talking about, the U.S. and Colombia have always been very close allies. Colombia has been the launching pad for so many destabilization campaigns across Latin America against leftist governments, particularly Venezuela. The U.S. has many military bases in Colombia. There are these paramilitary groups you mentioned that are tied to Colombian oligarchs who are tied to the U.S. So this is incredible what's happening, but of course we have to be we can't forget that the U.S. is constantly planning, is constantly interfering. You know, what's the potential here for what the U.S. could do? I mean, the U.S. and the Colombian military, the security apparatus, are still very close. That hasn't changed. That doesn't change overnight. So I guess what is the kind of like backlash from the U.S. that is to be expected here? And I assume that in Colombia, the people who are currently in power are expecting something to take place. Not maybe they don't know exactly what, but what are the opportunities the U.S. has to take advantage of?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, during the inauguration, of course, there's a lot of international delegations. Of course, the U.S. government sent a delegation, and they had meetings with the government of Gustavo Petro. They've had meetings. Samantha Power met with Francia Márquez. It's important to point out that they are not closed off to relations with the U.S., and they know that it would only count against them to have a hostile attitude from the get-go. I think even the socialist governments in Latin America have always been open to dialogue. And with this government of Gustavo Petro, I think they're very clear on the fact that first of all, Gustavo Petro is not anti-capitalist. He's not planning on completely, you know, revamping the entire economic model that Colombia operates on. He's going to make important changes in the society, improve the lives of millions of people. And yes, there are going to be definite changes with its relations to the U.S. in foreign policy. It's not going to follow the same lines, but I think that relationship is always going to be there. I think they're definitely wary. They're definitely cautious. But in the end, I think the U.S. is seeing that they can no longer use their same tricks. It would be interesting to look at what's happened in Honduras. The government of Xiomara Castro obviously put an end to 12 years of National Party rule supported by the United States, financed by the United States, made possible by the United States. They've maintained relationships with the U.S. government still, but they are implementing important changes. So I think it's a dynamic situation. There's no way to say what's going to happen, but it's, of course, I think this government is very clear that it is completely challenging the interests of the ruling class in Colombia, the ruling class in the United States, and they know they have a lot of adversaries. The right wing in Colombia has been extremely reactionary on social media, launching a lot of different defamation campaigns, constantly barraging, leftist activists, trying to say that everyone is spies, sponsored by Cuba or terrorists, all that normal,
typical stuff.
Stuff. But I think it's clear that that's going to happen, and they have. I mean, what the elections show and what the uprising really showed in 2021 is that the people want change, and the change is going to happen. It has to happen. They can no longer tolerate a situation where the economy is so horrible, where unemployment is at such a bad rate, and so I think they're going to be, dealing with what happens as it goes.
Well, People's Dispatch, I know, is covering this and basically everything else very closely. Just for those who are watching, where can they find all the things that you all are doing?
So you can find us at peoplesdispatch.org, at People's Dispatch on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And, follow us on all those platforms. We also have a weekly podcast and show, Give the People What They Want, with Vijay Prashad, who's the director of Track Continental and the chief correspondent of Globetrotter. Very good 30-minute summary of the week's news. Check it out. Give us a follow. Share some love. And, thanks.
Give the People What They Want, which also features Zoe and Prasanth. Great show. Watch it. Anyway, as always, of course, Zoe, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.